Let's get started. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the monthly VC breakfast. We're going to be talking about the healthcare webinar. I apologize. Normally these events are in person due to the pandemic. I think it's going to be a webinar series now for a while. But thank you everyone for coming. I hope everyone's staying safe. Their team, family, friends are all doing okay. This month, well, for those who are probably joining for the first time, the monthly VC breakfast is just an event that I try to host on a either monthly or bi-monthly basis, where we try to focus on a specific industry. We typically, let me get my pointer here. We typically try to give you investors a huge list of startups within that particular industry that's filtered with the top startups marked. Included is a pretty large due diligence report that's really just focused on how the top startups products differentiate. And then the unfortunate part now that it's a webinar, but normally for the first half hour we do a networking session. That's a lot harder to do over Zoom with a lot of participants. But at the same time, I also try to give you a list of all the startups that are currently fundraising in that space, so you have some takeaway. And then most of this webinar and these events, there's a presentation that more or less summarizes some of the larger takeaways of the industry report that we go and review. This month, we're talking about the healthcare industry. I know it's probably at the top of everyone's mind currently with the current environment that we're in. You'll see, I don't know if everyone in the chat panel, but I sent everyone and the attendees as well. There's a Google Drive link that'll give you access to the list of around 4,000 healthcare startups filtered out into about 19 different categories with the top companies marked. On top of that, there is a pretty lengthy report. This report is kind of breaks down, like I said, how the top startups from that Excel spreadsheet, how they break down at the product level, how they really differentiate. You guys have access to both. The goal is to hopefully give you, this is the deal sourcing and due diligence you need to at least start when making investments in the healthcare industry. And then the presentation again today, we're just going to be reviewing some of the categories from this pretty long report. I'm actually super excited because I'm joined by a panel of gentlemen that agreed to join me. They're going to be kind of sitting in the background, and as we go through this presentation, the summary of that report, they're going to give a little bit more color. And I'm really happy to have these guys because all of them are active healthcare investors who've worked for healthcare companies, understand the ecosystem, and might also be able to provide you with some unique insight. So it would be awesome, panelists, if you could introduce yourself. I'll start with Arnold, and then we'll kind of move our way to the right. So Arnold, did you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Arnold. I'm a recovering physician. Was in clinical practice for quite a while. I was at One Medical, starting out as employee number 5. After a time, I moved into machine learning with a company called Lumiata. And I've now found myself in the venture space. Very thrilling industry, especially in the healthcare field.
Thanks, Arnold. Qi, did you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. This is Qi. Work with the CentreGold Capital, a seed fund, a $25 million seed fund. Spend a lot of time in food and health, where I'm leading a team doing early stage investing in focusing on how software-driven healthcare startups. We're spending a lot of time in, solving issues around care accessibility and physician burnout and the payment transparency.
Thanks, Qi. Gaurav, did you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Gaurav. I work at Mayo Clinic Ventures. And as you can imagine, we are a healthcare investor. We look at everything that is healthcare. Obviously, we have different teams that look at different categories. I mostly focus on diagnostic devices, software, healthcare IT, a little bit of pharma, but we have a separate team that deals with it. Background, I've been always been healthcare person. All my career had prior roads, starting in R&D to corporate venture and product management along the way. Nice to meet you.
Thanks, Gaurav. And then Raymond.
Hi, I'm Ramon Jimenez. I'm a recovering attorney, and yeah, we are. I advise venture companies here on international investment opportunities, and help with startup fundraising for international companies coming to the U.S. I had the pleasure of working with as a venture partner at Movens Capital, where we have invested into connected devices for healthcare and AI for drug discovery companies. I also had the recent worked in an AI for discovery company, and that which was acquired by Konica Minolta. So it's a very interesting space to be in. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, guys. So again, I really appreciate it that you guys all took the time to attend. It's a long event. If you have to leave, don't worry. But thanks again for joining. So I'll have these guys kind of sit in the background and give some commentary. The healthcare categories that we're actually going to talk today are mostly software or smart hardware solutions or services within the healthcare industry, not pharmaceutical products. The categories that are in that 4,000 startup list and that healthcare report, I broke it down, those 4,000 companies, into these 19 main categories. Really, how I broke this apart is purely by functionality. You can go and break healthcare in a lot of different ways. I did it in this particular method because it made the most sense. Now, there are a number of other healthcare categories that I did not cover, mostly because I didn't have enough time. The healthcare space is so vast. I underestimated how much work this would be compared to all the other industries that we've done. But a big point that I want to mention is we're not covering what I think is like the pharmaceutical products. In this case, I call it therapy products or medical, non-smart medical devices. There's a couple like specialized software solutions for dentists, or we didn't cover pharmacy software either. But I'll kind of talk about how these two main categories split up a little bit later. But for this presentation and the report and the startups you receive, I think most of you are going to want to be focused on these main categories here. This presentation breaks into 3 parts. We're going to first focus on fundraising trends, where a majority of the capital flows into the different 19 healthcare categories. This just kind of gives you a general feel of where other investors find value and where there might be value in the healthcare industry. Then we're going to be, for the bulk of the presentation, focusing on the specific healthcare categories that I mentioned before, and talking a little bit more details at the product level, what's trending. As a venture investor, I think it's important that we kind of review in detail what are making some of these healthcare categories great and what we should be looking for. And then finally, at the end, I included a list of about 30 startups that are currently fundraising. I think they're interesting. You might want to be looking into them. It ranges from seed through Series B. So you'll actually at least have something to take away from this presentation. Don't worry, this presentation is recorded and I'll publish it later. So if you miss anything, you can always come back to it. So let's start off with the fundraising trend. I'm going to kind of review a handful of slides. Panelists, I have questions for you towards the end, but feel free to jump in at any time if you want to add anything. But for the first thing I kind of want to highlight to investors is if you, on a fundraising trend and a deal-by-deal basis, what I kind of like to do is I like to break down, especially for CVCs. In this case, I looked at all the deals that were invested by telecoms the last 2 years, the top 10 institutional funds, and some of the tech giants. And one of the big things I want to mention to you is that healthcare is within at least the top 3 or top 5 most invested categories. So as a venture investor that's interested in this space, this is a category that is important to a lot of investors, and it's a category to at least pay attention to and be aware of. Now, to break down the total healthcare funding across those 19 categories, you can kind of see here those 19 categories that I mentioned earlier in alphabetical order. The total amount of funding that I looked at aggregate is around 60 billion. I only looked at companies that had a fundraising event, a closure, or an exit within the last 3 years. Not startups that were started in the last 3 years, but just any event that happened in the last 3 years. The reason why is there's a ridiculous amount of healthcare startups. Just in the last 3 years, I had to filter through 10,000 companies, and that it's a lot. So bear in mind, as you look through some of these statistics and numbers, it's only companies that have an event in the last 3 years. I still think it's a good representation of some of the trends, but for the most part, you can kind of see on the left-hand side here, the second column is the overall funding per category. It kind of gives you a general idea of where a majority of the funding tends to flow to. The total number of startups that are in each category. You have the average funding here as well, which is on average how much funding goes to each company in this category. And this is just a good idea of how venture investors value each category. I try to, for a lot of investors, because I know some of you are US based and some are international investors, I try to differentiate the funding based on startups that are based in the US and then all startups outside of the United States. And this varies a lot. For example, you'll notice that it's about 50-50 split for the total number of startups in the US versus international startups that are in that 4,000 list of startups that you receive. But US startups, and it's not a surprise, end up raising 60% of the total amount of funding for the categories that I mapped, and then end up having a much higher average funding ratio, and on average end up raising $8 million more than international startups. But this varies a lot per category. As you can see, the average funding abroad for some categories and versus the US. Now, I try to color code this so you can kind of see what are the highest numbers versus the lowest. It's a lot of numbers. I know you guys have time to look at this, back at this in detail, but to just kind of give you a general feel of where funding kind of aligns per category, you can kind of look at the color code. But I also try to highlight in the red boxes here, generally what are the most funded categories. And this just kind of gives you an indicator of where you might want to be looking at as a venture investor. This varies in the US, it's still relatively the same for the overall funding, but abroad, you have a lot more funding that tends to go into marketplaces, which obviously drives up some of that average funding. By the way, average funding, I try to average it out, remove the companies that were exited and also closed, and I try to get rid of the outliers as well. The top 5%, highest and lowest funding amount, so that way we don't get any numbers that are too off. So this is a pretty good estimate to work from. Now, the other thing that I want to highlight here is the total number of exits and closures. So you have the 19 healthcare categories that we talked about. The overall, the amount of startups that exit in those last 3 years relative to the total number of startups in the last 3 years, and the same with closures as well, and how that breaks down for US international. Now this, as a venture investor, is very important. It gives you an idea of where's liquidity here per category and the risk in each category as well. Now, I've done a lot of these industry events and I've broken down a lot of industries, and I will tell you on average, 10% exit percentage is about the average that I see across industries. So if it's below that, it's a little bit more riskier, not a lot of liquidity. If it's above that, it's great. It's also not a surprise that the US companies have a lot more liquidity than companies abroad. So investors that are looking at investing into healthcare companies abroad, you might want to have a really good strategy for making an investment abroad. The other thing that I recently added, you saw this probably in the last cybersecurity event, but for this event, I try to add a couple new categories. I have what's called investor indexes. My goal is to help a lot of you guys understand where you should focus your time. 4,000 companies, there's a lot of categories to look at. Where do you might want to spend your time as a venture investor in the healthcare space? So again, here are the 19 categories in the far left column. The watch index, for those of you that received the Excel spreadsheet, I mark what I think are the top companies. The top companies are defined as what are great founders. Overall, seems like a great product for its category, has a great investor backing. This is the total number of companies or top startups in comparison to the total number of startups within that category. It's really is just to give you a sentiment at what are the categories that are hot, or what are at least categories that you might want to be paying attention to. The higher the percentage, you probably should at least review it. Strategic index is slightly similar. This is really zeroing in on the amount of companies that have received funding from, healthcare CVCs, both hospitals, pharmaceutical companies. I also include tech giants and top 10 institutional funds. This index is trying to give you a little bit more look as a venture investor as to those who have larger stakes in the healthcare ecosystem, where they see value, where they find value, where are they most interested in. And this is just a different look at where you might want to be looking at healthcare as well, and how that's important for those who are healthcare CVCs. Now, the cash multiple is something that's slightly different that I added versus the cybersecurity category. You didn't see that in the previous events. This is just the metric here is for every dollar that you invest, how much should you expect in return at a liquidity event? So if you invest $1 into an analytics company, you should expect that you should hope to receive $35 in return for every dollar that you invest. This is based on the probability of startups in this category being acquired, and this is the probability of reaching, a return within 7 years with the expected 10% discount rate. But the easiest way to think about this category here is just to think about the higher the number, the more risky the category is. So for example, if you want to invest in healthcare devices, it's a very risky category. There's not a lot of liquidity here. So if you're going to invest, you have to have a pretty strong, as a venture investor, understanding that for the risk that you're taking, you should expect a pretty large return to meet your fund obligations. And then there's equity percentage, which is for every $1 million you invest in each category, what is the equity stake that you should expect? This is really just to kind of give you a sense of how expensive each industry is, give you a little bit of a baseline of, if you're getting more equity, great. If you're getting less equity, you should be really thinking about how it relates to the overall ecosystem. I know there's different ranges. This is not for all stages. I know there's seed through Series F, but for the most part, this is just a good indicator of overall what are categories that are more expensive. Now, the US and international indexes are slightly different, right? In the US, cash multiples lower, which means there's a lot more liquidity. So obviously, it's less risky to invest in US-based companies based on the numbers I have here. International, it's higher, right, overall. But on the same time, companies abroad are much cheaper, right? From the strategic investors, there's a lot more strategic investors investing in US-based companies. Now, bear in mind, most of the strategic investors that I have, whether it's healthcare CVCs, top 10 institutional funds, a lot of them are US-based investors, so there might be some skew in this, but overall, what I tried to highlight here in the red boxes are what are the categories that have kind of an equal amount of low cash multiple, but pretty high strategic or watch index. And these are some of the categories based on these numbers alone are some of just categories that you might want to be paying attention to as an venture investor if you're looking to invest in this space. Now, this differs in the US and versus international. But for the most part, this is just kind of give you a look at, where's the categories that are of most interest that might provide is the least riskiest, but also might be the best for your fund, right? And before I answer some of the panel, some of you guys' questions, real quick, I wanted to share, these are the categories that I didn't map, the 10 categories that I mentioned earlier. The categories that I did map is around 60 billion in capital. For the categories I didn't over the last 3 years, it's almost 100 billion. The majority of that funding goes to therapeutic products. This is pharmaceutical products, right? Anything for cancers, for cured diseases, inflammation, what have you, is here. Start raise a lot of money. It's a whole different game. I didn't have time to go into this, so for all these numbers, I couldn't thoroughly vet these statistics, but I just wanted to give you an idea of the other side of the healthcare ecosystem that we're not touching today is also just as vast. And as a venture investor, this is a really big space to take on. So just be cautious on what your products you're actually looking at. But I kind of want to go back because I wanted to ask a little bit of the panel just general thoughts on funding, right? And any one of you guys feel free to speak up at any time, but what is your thoughts on the funding trends? I know a lot of you guys are early stage investors. I know Chi and Arnold, you invest at the earlier stages. How do you approach a pretty large category like this? And what categories are you guys actually interested in?
I could potentially take that. I mean, we look at, so the way DigiTx Partners works is that we are early stage, yes, we are sweet spot Series A. We like to focus on database solutions. We tend to prefer things, as I think I talked to you about this before, that we're looking at closed loop things that have unique ways of capturing data, offering actionable insights with a little bit of a predictive angle as well. And what we do is that we find that if you're able to, what's the word for it again? Give me a second here. If you're able to find something that's unique and that's actually really, really compelling, investment should be done. And we find that in terms of funding trends, we're probably going to see a swing back into the digital health category because you're going to see more remote patient solutions popping up. You're going to see solutions that are going to be solving for where a patient no longer has to go into the hospital. So kind of a hospital home scenario. That's where digital health is kind of poised to kind of take a leap forward. So I think for us, this is kind of where our fund thesis actually, or fund focus is. We're not looking to, find a solution that's going to like bring the patient into the hospital per se. So I think that's kind of where what we would be looking at. So I hope that answers that question.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I really like how you like put together this how you put together this presentation, slice the market. And at CentreGold Capital, like we look at a slightly different in terms of like, the use cases of technologies and what kind of diseases they cover. I think in the early days, what do I find pretty interesting? We see a lot of money flowing into places like digital therapeutic and so on and so forth. It could be, prescription based, could be, a service based. And I think recently, like people starting realize that agnostic platform tend to working a little bit less efficient when compared to disease and the disorder focus. And we also find that people realize how a lot of spaces, for example, mental health and behavioral health, and that's what a lot of software, patient-facing software addressing. That is requires high touch patient experience, where a lot of tech-enabled services become more popular. Yep. And then it definitely, covers, when we're talking about disease and disorder focus, it tend to, not a one-stop shop, but more of, targeting a broad range of services from a technology from, how care is being delivered and the utilization of devices and mobile applications as well.
Definitely. Okay.
So a couple.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, just a couple of comments, I guess. First of all, these are my comments and not Mayo Clinic's comments, but a couple of observations here. I think, since the data is from 2017 to present, it would be interesting to see how these highlighted categories actually trend over time. Based on experience, what we have seen is, 2016, 2015, or 2017 were the years when a lot of a specific disease condition devices or diagnostics were starting to take off, and that's just a result of data and AI trend. But I think I would bet that what we have seen more recently is that is going down, and more data management and analytics platform are popping up with the idea that they can actually serve not just one diagnostic condition, but multiple conditions or devices. So that's a trend that we have seen. We have done a number of specific devices and diagnostic, we still do, but a lot of the things that now we are looking at are around data, given that most of the healthcare AI or IT is focusing on data where the biggest value is. Sorry, Arnold, keep going. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's perfect, Gaurav. I think that's a great segue, and I think Gaurav is making is spot on. At DigiTx, we're also seeing a lot of platform plays, literally, that are covering more than just one disease process. It would be more efficient to process multiple diseases versus being a unitasker, so to speak. And I think that's kind of the wave of the future, especially if you're going to move into a space where you're going to be dealing with chronic disease patients. They're not going to have just one specific disease. They may have diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and they may have CHF. So it's vital that these platforms that process data from different disease sets and give you those insights. That's kind of what we've been seeing so far. We like some of the platforms, but again, we focus on the predictive nature. So if you can evaluate that for any of these data platforms, you're not just giving just CDS tools. You might be able to give an idea of where decompensation is going to be in the next few months. So that's kind of what would be interesting, at least from our perspective.
Okay. And I'm curious, how do you guys, Raymond, if you wanted to speak up.
Well, I was just merely concur with everyone else. I mean, I think what everyone says is like I have everything to agree with. The one thing I would add to that is, when evaluating a company is that, I think we'll talk about this throughout the morning, is that there is a crossover between regulation, current changes in regulation, and changes in, and also working with the incumbent biotechs, right? In drug discovery companies. So we have to, when we're looking at this, we're thinking like we're very gung ho about these new technologies, but it's going to be very hard to change existing regulatory frameworks. So anything you look at has to either conform to the current healthcare regulations, either in terms of privacy or drug discovery, regulatory process, FDA approval, in order to make a decision to invest or not.
Gotcha. Okay. I got two more follow-up questions to you guys as well on top of this. How do your views differ from looking at US-based companies to international companies, regardless of what country they're in? And it kind of may have built on your last point there, Raymond. And then, in my personal experience, and maybe this must be the data that I have currently, but for me, looking at the liquidity ratio here, it seems relatively low compared to some other industries. Do you guys have any concerns here? Do you think it's a lot more challenge to invest in healthcare?
In general, it is a challenge to invest in healthcare because healthcare is a very different animal from standard investments. I mean, this is probably not the best analogy in the world, but healthcare versus SaaS system, SaaS investments. Healthcare can be very monolithic. Healthcare organizations can potentially move at Godzilla-like speeds, and you have a lot of legacy thinking in the healthcare industry. So those are potential obstacles to how, what's the word for it again? Revolutionary technology could be accepted. You look at long sales cycles, sometimes they can take up to 18 months. These are things that we've seen where companies and startups that have very, very, very compelling solutions have struggled to gain adoption because of multiple stakeholders. So if you're going to invest in healthcare, you got to be patient. You got to believe in the product. You got to believe in the team, and know you're going for the long haul. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. So things are changing, and you're going to see, I think, especially, I hate to bring up the obvious elephant in the room, COVID-19. It's going to accelerate a lot of evolution in terms of how people approach and regulate healthcare. The FDA is getting more involved, and always look to work with the FDA. They're not there to kind of stop you. They're there to help you. And I think it's working closely with them is going to help a lot of startups accelerate their product, and it's also going to get them more traction in terms of stakeholders in large legacy systems. So it sounds a little vague, but what I'm trying to say is that if you work and be patient and you work with the right stakeholders, you're probably going to get where you want to be. But again, not everybody's going to be successful.
Yeah, to address the two question you're asking, yes, I guess I'll answer the second question regarding the future and exit opportunity. Yes, it was early on, when we started looking at the software driven health tech, it was a little bit concerning, just by looking at how many exit opportunities are out there in terms of merger and acquisition and IPOs, right? And there were definitely a lot of a few small deals going on. But I guess at the same time in the past year we've seen a sort of consolidation of several categories in the chronic diseases and behavioral health spaces, and more, especially this year as a couple of report just came out, and we've seen like more sizable players will be sort of like merging through this wave of consolidation, which is it kind of opens up more opportunity for deal makers. I believe in the long run, and at the same time, I guess the market sizing has always been questions, right? Like and penetration time to the market at the same time, and this COVID actually has been a great timing to accelerate the adoption of the virtual care, and make this type of a health tech more attractive from both financial and strategic point of view. To addressing your first question, and how's the investment in international startups versus investment in the U.S. Because unlike medical device in the pharma, because a lot of times health tech was in software health tech. Is also addressing part of the clinical workflow, and also addressing a part of how care is being delivered, which means it tend to be restricted by the infrastructure sophistication and how sort of like policies in different countries, whether it's support to certain areas or not. And startup cannot avoid dealing with sort of like the status quo and how insurance provider system works. And we actually look at a health tech in developing countries, and since they kind of, a lot of those countries, they kind of rely heavily more on the urgent care side instead of primary care, and out of pockets like the norms of patient tolerance. For example, patient tolerance on pricing points could be low, and some applications, even if they show improved outcomes, but may not be commercialized well due to the unit economies challenge. And also when there's no primary care, you need to find your own specialist, and maybe brick and mortar, maybe like the telehealth focus on certain specific categories of disease and disorders works out more. And speaking of the policies also, for example, in China, like if you don't have the government stamp, you can't even do genetic testing, because the government is pretty concerned with the data privacy and all that stuff.
I think to chime in too as well from an overseas perspective, if you're going to go into an overseas market, you got to understand the cultural paradigms of different countries. And to back up Chi's point, rules and laws, Europe has GDPR, and how much more people are focusing on privacy ever than before. There might even be a future trend where cybersecurity is highly enforced, and digital health companies or investors looking to invest in digital health companies overseas need to understand the legal ramifications of such laws, cultural paradigms, and whether you really should be putting your money into an overseas investment. Not to say you shouldn't, it's just that you have to have a better understanding and thorough research before you take that plunge.
Yeah, no, I think, I want to pick on a couple of things that you guys mentioned. First one is a consolidation. I think, given these numbers, especially in devices and diagnostic, I think it's just not practical to expect the exist to go up. It's just not, reality. I think as a result of that, you're going to start seeing a lot of consolidation, or even if you have exits, those are going to be, pretty low value exit than what someone would expect. We have actually already seen a number of consolidation happening within the startup industry itself. So rather than, someone buying and then consolidating, we have seen startup companies coming together. And that's just, how the probably market is working right now. And then the second one is cybersecurity. And Kyle and I was just talking the other day. Given that most of the companies are moving towards platform data play, cybersecurity and healthcare is starting to merge, especially with the new laws that are coming in, not just GDPR, but I'm blanking on the California's new privacy law. And we are looking at yeah, thank you. There you go. And we are looking at companies that can deliver that next level of cybersecurity for all these data and analytics and platform companies. So sort of a merger of healthcare and cyber security coming together in the healthcare space, especially.
Awesome. Great.
And well, I was going to say one last thing is like that, Movens Capital is actually a European fund based in Poland, and we're using that difference between investing abroad and locally to the advantage of the fund. So as I want to mention here is that you have to deal with the local regulations that they differ quite differently between regions and within and then also within countries. So you can make investments into, for example, medical device which has approval within the European Union and then within Poland that creates a walled garden from other larger incumbent players. But again, that gets complicated. It works for us because we're actually there in market.
Gotcha. Great. Any other last thoughts before I move on to talking about specific product categories? Cool. Okay, so let's thanks guys. I appreciate the thoughts. And Michael, I know you have a question here. Well, I think that question will bring up a little bit later when we talk about health management category, and it might answer your question. But the next part of the presentation, where you kind of dive into the specific categories. The first part, I want to kind of break through or talk specifically about categories that I think are pretty actively involved in patient health and care, and some of them have overlap. But the second part, which I highly doubt we'll get to because I don't think we have enough time, but most of the categories that are more for operational improvement, especially working directly with providers, researchers, etc., and that many of these also have overlap in patient care as well. But we're going to be really focusing on the categories that receive the most amount of funding. So first, we're going to jump into the device category. This category, like I said, has a significant amount of funding, has the most number of startups for all the companies that I mapped out. Has a pretty low exit ratio, but I think that's also because there's a significant amount of startups. It's a pretty risky category to invest in. But the device category is defined really as any smart IoT solution that is a part of any part of health application. I split it up into 32 subsections. The most popular is the patient monitoring. These are the majority of the companies fall into: heart health and diabetes. The rest, you can see examples here. We're not going to go into every single one. We don't have enough time. But this is the most number of startups of the top companies down. I want to kind of spend a little bit of time talking about what are product trends in each of the top three categories, and then just general, including overall. But one thing I do want to note is that the report that all of you guys received that's in the Google Drive, at the end of every subsection, there's a little segment that talks about what's important. So it kind of gives you a summary of every single section and about what you should be looking for as an investor. So on the patient monitoring category, the startups really in this section, from what I've seen, really kind of focus on two things. It's just watching or monitoring patient activity or monitoring patient vitals. Now, how these startups differentiate in this section is how they accomplish these objectives. And they use a variety of different hardware, software, service models. I think the trend that many of these startups are making is they're trying to make the devices comfortable or unnoticeable, or use a minimal number of devices as possible. And this is kind of an overall trend that I'm seeing across every single category. A lot of these companies for every single space are trying to make their devices comfortable, unique, more, especially for consumers, enjoyable and aesthetically pleasing to use. The startups that actually are measuring vitals, especially in hospital settings for the patient monitoring category, try to use at least one device to measure as many vitals as possible. There's other startups that use a service model to provide a variety of different devices to measure specific vitals if it's necessary. Patient monitoring overlaps a lot with every single one of these categories. And so there definitely is a lot of overlap, but the objective of these companies overall is to manage, monitor patients. Now, there's a lot of difference between the breadth and depth of the information these startups are collecting. Some are, able to measure down to specific actions, like what are people doing? Are they taking medication? Are they going to the bathroom? Other startups, they're just built for one purpose. For example, some provide blood pressure monitoring solutions as well in the patient monitoring category, and it's just to monitor blood pressure. Now, what matters most in the patient monitoring category, and this is true for every single device category, and this blends in with every, we talked about before, digital therapeutics, is, startups are trying to build, and I've highlighted here is startups that are building actual workflows, dashboards that really help either care providers analyze and understand, or even patients know the progress of their health, resolve issues, jump in, provide feedback. And you're seeing the device category really blend with the health management category, telemedicine, especially management for, providers, care management. But there's a lot of companies in patient monitoring. Now, on the heart health side, there's a lot of overlap with patient monitoring, heart health. This category really tends to be focusing on making sure to monitor or analyze heart rate to identify either heart diseases or issues. Some are to predict, things like cardiac arrest. Startups in this section also differentiate by the variety of different methods they use to collect heart data. Some are using radar, some use clothing. You can see examples here. There's wearables for chest, wrist, leg. There's implants. You can see examples here. There's specifics like scales, a smartphone camera. There's a lot, and there's a huge variety. Now, some startups are selling their devices directly to consumers for continuous use, while others, like this company here, tends to just rent out their devices for a short period of time to just collect healthcare reading. And again, this overlaps a lot with the patient monitoring category. And then finally, the diabetes section. Startups really in this segment really tend to be focusing on two major things, either tracking blood glucose sugar levels or blood sugar levels, or administering insulin, or a combination of both, right? The startups that track blood sugar levels vary in their methods of doing so. Some utilize non-invasive, infrared light. Others have wearables that are attached to the skin. Some devices claim to provide more accurate readings of the test strips. Some combine, one device that does the lancing, the blood collection, and the analysis. Some are using, like, for example, POTS Diabetes here, using smartphone or leveraging the smartphone to measure blood sugar. What really matters, especially for some of these categories, and diabetes as well, as the accuracy of these measurements. Startups that administer insulin, they come in different forms. Some are smart devices that track insulin doses and temperature. Others are, some actually provide wearables, wearable insulin pumps, and that include kind of a glucose meter. But again, especially for the diabetes category, all the best innovative devices are accompanied with a web or mobile application that help users visualize or track their progress. And a lot of times it ties into providing different recommendations to improve health, and that again overlaps with the health management category. And this is really the general trend overall that we're seeing. Now, there are some very specific to each category. Hearing aids is very specific, unique needs, or stethoscopes, endoscopes, etc. They all have very unique features about each category, and you can look into that in the report. But overall, this is just the general trend that I'm seeing among healthcare devices. Now, I wanted to jump back into the panel here because a lot of you guys have made investments in this category. And Arnold, specifically, you've done investments into companies like Echo. You've done a couple, or Amber Labs, and or at least your fund is invested in a handful of companies in that range. The device category is vast, and I'm curious, how, as a venture investor, why did you make these types of bets in the space, the ones that you've done, and how do you compare when making a bet in the device category? How do you compare and prioritize, different subsections over one another?
I think DigiTx is a very unique fund in the sense that, yes, we do love our exits like any venture investor does, but we also look at clinical utility. So if you look at Echo, it's an enhancement and a digital stethoscope at the same time, because the stethoscope hasn't changed in the last over 100 years. It's been around since the 1800s. And the way the Echo team developed their product, they were able to actually develop proprietary algorithms that are able to actually detect atrial fibrillation in its earliest stages. I'm just saying what's on the website, but this is what we do know. And they were able to develop something that actually was able to work with Bluetooth technology. So you're looking at a stethoscope that's kind of like way ahead of most of the things that you're seeing in the market now these days. They were able to bring this to market really quickly, scale up, and offer something to clinicians, also to patients, because the Duo can be used at home by people with chronic heart disease, and pretty much develop something that you didn't really see on the market at that time. So with the focus on clinical utility, DigiTx saw Echo being adopted in multiple different environments, healthcare, life sciences, also for take home at the same time. I can speak to Ember Labs too as well. It's a consumer device. Yes, it's kind of like not technically what you would see in a digital health realm, but the way Ember actually captured clinical data, offered actionable insights, and treated a problem. This was one of our digital therapeutics plays, because Ember actually treats hot flashes. So it takes care of an unmet need, especially in women where they can't really tolerate certain medications or don't want to take medications. Ember offers an alternative to help with menopausal hot flashes, which is an inherent problem that a lot of people do suffer from. And sometimes taking pills is not a solution that people will be looking for. So we focus on something that catered to an unmet need and had a unique way of delivering the care and that's from Ember's perspective. You look at GTech, it's also a unique data capture solution. It's kind of a gut EKG of sorts. It's capturing electrical signal from the GI system and analyzing stuff in the cloud and delivering actionable insights, allowing people to figure out what to do in certain situations, certain pathological situations involving the GI system. So we don't just focus only on just the exit, but we focus on clinical utility. So that's kind of how we look at these devices that we invested in. It's kind of like, who can we reach and who can we impact? So you could say that DigiTx not only looks at exits, but we also look at how we impact patient care and patient lives. So that's kind of how we looked at these devices. Gotcha.
Now, Qi, you actually made an investment into what I categorize as a patient monitoring device. I think it's called Circadia. And correct me if I'm wrong, but they have a really unique solution that does contactless and sensing that I think is riding a lot of the trends of the patient monitoring devices. Why did you make this specific investment?
Right. So before diving into that, I want to add, a little bit more perspective on investing in the space, because what I found really, really interesting early on is that, unlike a traditional medical device where, you got an FDA clarification, it's basically the end of not the end product development, but pretty much there's nothing much you could do about it. But with the software as a medical device, a lot of time if you get the especially a combination of hardware and software, when you get to, for example, 510K, right? That's actually the beginning of the game, where the novel piece really comes from the software side, and there's a lot of stuff you could do. And after that, how to use software, because of the lower risk to patient, and it helps more in personalization and is more scalable. And how do you actually leverage that to make the product a novel and to sort of like reiterate the development cycle and all that stuff. and and also, you know, referring to, you know, some of the gentleman's point before, the data side and the predictive and analytics side is actually what makes it really powerful and in the long run. And you know, and giving a security example, for example, RPM code has been widely available, you know, a long time ago, and because of the initial path to monetization is more clear, and it definitely, you know, has been like heating up a lot more lately, and but it also has to do with something like, you know, disease targeting insight, and what vital signs you monitor, and what actionable insight you actually deliver, and that's what actually security is targeting. And so for example, you know, COPD and asthma can accelerate really quickly within less than 30 minutes. So unless, you know, the current unmet need out there is how people tracking, you know, respiratory rates and related biomarkers, how frequent they check it, right? And also, you know, pulse. They do it probably like, you know, twice a day, you know, with inpatient and when home, and there's not a lot of ways people would put enough, you know, attention to that. And in some other cases, like post-stroke patients show like, you know, a greater risk in obstructive sleep apnea, which is also, you know, something people tend to not pay enough attention to. So predicting those events via, like, you know, the sound and breathing pattern before, you know, it happens can actually, you know, sort of like save lives, let's put it that way, which is what actually the team is working towards at Cicadia, and after receiving their first, you know, class 2, you know, 510K very recently.
Okay. And I'm curious, both Gaurav and Raymond, what are your guys' views on the device landscape, and, you know, where do you think there are opportunities?
So, so we are involved. We have a medical device. It's a connected echocardiogram device, and again, the particularities of our fund is that we're not a really considered ourselves a healthcare fund, but how do we make this work within our investment thesis? And I think for those in the audience who are not healthcare venture capitalists per se, is that we're investing into transformational change within society, and then you know, within the Venn diagram as well, you know, change actionable data. So in particular in this market, again, Movens Capital is in Europe. You know, the government has an interest in driving down healthcare costs because they're the single payer, and probably this will apply, you know, long-term trends probably in the US as well. So they have to move to online. There's a push, a national push to move towards digital health. It's just more efficient, less costly. It's how you service people in remote areas, you know, at lower cost. How do you get that digital health? How do you get physical health diagnostics and systems into a digital world? You have to have connected devices, and you have to have devices that can be used by a consumer that don't have to be applied by a medical healthcare professional. And so when we're looking at devices, and we're looking at healthcare in general, we look at that perspective within our business thesis. And so whenever that is our, I think, overarching particularity when we look at this category, and it's so far worked so well. Again, we're to be determined whether or not our current investments will have a large exit long term, but everything is looking good so far.
So I think, you know, from our point of view, I think, you know, I'm just going to give you a little bit of different viewpoint to this device category. I think, you know, the devices are today at least only a means to capture some data in a very broad perspective, right? Most of these companies are, what they're trying to do is commercialize the data that they capture directly through the device or entered into their platform. So, you know, even though we are investing in some of these devices, we like to see companies that have more broader application than just a device that is capturing something a good example, I think someone talked about Eco, and I see, a live code, and I see Koala. If you actually go a little bit deeper or dig into their business model, all of them are more data commercializing companies than a device. Yes, the device is absolutely needed because without that there's no way around it, at least today. So to me, the device itself is not as important as what the intersection of these device companies and maybe a data and a health management and some of the other categories I think we have looked at above, and how that overall plays. A good example would be, we are looking at a couple of companies where they are at an intersection of this, where the idea is, can the data captured by all these devices be commercialized, or maybe a better word is liquidified. And the reason, I think, again, we think it is important is device is good, but the data is where the real value is. So again, I would welcome some comments or even, questions, but a little bit of different viewpoint than I think what we have been talking about.
Awesome. Thanks, Gaurav. I'm going to move on to the next category here, but if you guys have any other last final comments or advice you'd like to give to investors, feel free to just jump in. The next slide here, I try to add this at the end of every category slide. I'm not going to go into detail about this, but just so everybody understands what these charts actually means. This chart here is trying to identify the categories that I highlighted, which is the 19 on the left-hand side here, how much of their products and services overlap with the other categories. This is a good idea to just see how categories are blending with one another. And we talked earlier about how there are categories that are merging. At the same time, it kind of gives you a better, for especially founders, a better view about how your product portfolio can grow over time. The device category overlaps a lot with health management, more care management for providers in the management section, and then also a lot of them provide some telemedicine services as well. And then this category here, this chart here, this is the same 19 categories that we have in this report. And on the top is really the list of just pretty general target customers. So when I went through every single website of the startups, the top startups that I listed, I tried to note who is their primary target customer. Oopsies. It might not be a given. This is just a general scale of just what I've seen, but this just highlights what it seems like most categories. Who are they selling to? Who are the real stakeholders? Now, there's a lot of overlap overall, but this just kind of gives you a quick view of what are the different stakeholders. So the next category we're going to jump into is the diagnosis category. It's almost a very similar size of that of the device category. There's a lot of companies within the space. This category broke into 20 subsections. The most popular startups that I mapped out here tend to focus on diagnosing cancer, some various forms of viruses, infections, and then there's a handful that are doing more just general blood testing services that can be used for a variety of different diagnoses. That includes many of those here. And then these are the rest of the examples of different diagnosis categories and how they split apart from the most number of startups, top startups, to the least bottom. I'll quickly review what are some of the most important takeaways from each of the top three most popular subsections within this category. First being cancer. Now, cancer, a trend among most startups in this section is really just testing blood for fragments of DNA, RNA, proteins, other types of biomarkers to identify cancer, analyze your genome to understand if there's any hereditary risks of cancer. But it varies across different forms of cancer. The ones that are more general tend to test blood in this form. Those that are focused on the digestive tract cancer tend to use image recognition. And that's from analyzing endoscopic images to taking stool samples and analyzing the images from that. For breast cancer, there's a handful of companies that are utilizing devices or just trying to measure skin surface temperature to identify breast cancer, and that's a trend that I've seen there. For skin cancer, a lot of devices or companies are building devices or using methods of using light or fluorescence to measure skin cell properties. But what really differentiates companies in cancer, especially in really every startup within this category, is how accurate, fast, early, and the sample size needed to make the diagnosis. I mean, this is the primary differentiator. Now, how they do this, there's a lot of different ways. Some are building proprietary preparation methods, and this is everything from sequencing to application, separation, especially when we're talking about measuring DNA. There's others that have built unique assays that have more accurate biochemical reagents for binding to different biomarkers. There's some startups that utilize large data sets and analytics software to find patterns among the data that they have collected to make a diagnosis. So there's a lot of different ways startups are approaching this problem. On the virus and infection side, this is a little bit more broad in how startups differentiate and the methods that they use to diagnose individuals with specific infections or viruses. There's a lot of different examples. There's some companies that analyze immune system's response or RNA. There's others that use, are doing sequencing of pathogens and bacteria. There's companies that are measuring the movement of bacteria. And there's a pretty wide variety here. I think BioDirection, I really like how they have this visual here that it does a pretty good example of the different methods that you can use to identify biomarkers as well. Their assay can use enzymes, cells, DNA, nanoparticles that identify the presence of a virus infection by measuring the reactions of light or heat. This could be pH change, this could be mass change. But especially in this category specifically, and this also is kind of a big important differentiator for the diagnosis category, is startups in this section can really identify the right, they're trying to identify the right treatment and drugs that are most likely to be effective based on the diagnosis that they make. And this is really to just accelerate the treatment. And this is a trend that I'm seeing a lot in this category, but it does overlap in many others here. On the blood test side, there's startups that offer unique blood collection devices, and some of these are not necessarily smart solutions or IoT solutions, more of a service, and then there's others that offer blood testing services. Now, the startups that are focused on blood collection are providing assays or readers that use unique reagents or processors to measure blood contents for biomarkers for specific diseases. These devices typically differentiate the breadth of diagnostic tests that they can provide, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, and then the amount of blood sample that is required, and then how much tests you can run on each sample. And this is kind of falls into the major differentiator that we talked about for a lot of the other categories as well. The startups that offer blood test services are more interested, a lot of them are consumer focused, and they're more interested in helping patients proactively monitor their health, and these are typically at-home blood tests. Some are using unique collection devices. This company here collects tampons, used tampons. There's others that help you set up tests at local clinics. And they're really, a lot of these companies, especially in this whole category, are doing these screenings for infections, diagnosing acute diseases. It's pretty broad, or just to monitor patients overall. But for the most part, the overall trend, and especially for the categories that I see here on the right that we're not going to go into, is that it's how quickly and how early we can make a diagnosis, and how fast and how accurate that actually is. And that's how companies do this. Is what is the primary differentiator they see here. I think one of the things I wanted to ask you guys, Arnold, I know you made an investment into a couple of companies that I think are part of the diagnosis category, and I probably put them under the mental health diagnosis. And this is kind of a question not only to you, Arnold, but for the rest of the panel. How do you guys prioritize the type of disease or virus or a diagnosis that you want to make? And how would you approach a category like this that has a pretty broad set of tools and a variety of different methods to approach either specific diseases or a broad set of diagnosis?
So from a DigiTx perspective, we focus on the data collection, and we use uniqueness to the data. Yes, we do like certain things. One of our team members has a neuroscience focus, so you coincidentally will see things like NQ Medical and Sabonics, but Sabonics was an earlier investment at a seed stage. NQ Medical was a very interesting platform because it focuses on Parkinson's disease, and the way they actually developed the algorithm was what really captured our attention, and how they were uniquely using existing technology like your smartphone or your laptop to capture those data insights and delivering it in a fashion where you could do something about it. So we don't necessarily focus on specific disease process, but we do like chronic disease management. So you could see one of our other portfolio companies, WellDoc, focuses on diabetes. We now have NQ, which focuses on Parkinson's, and then you have Sabonics, which focuses on Alzheimer's disease. So we're kind of disease agnostic and more focused on the data. If you could kind of that's kind of how I would summarize how DigiTx approaches the problem.
Gotcha. Okay. And Gaurav, you mentioned. Go ahead, Gaurav.
No, I would agree with everything actually Arnold said, that especially for someone like us, we are disease agnostic, but what we do focus on is a long-term strategy and a value creation, and that at least today with all these kind of companies comes from data collection and what the use of that data can be. There is a completely separate business model that we actually haven't touched on while talking about diagnosis, is providing the secondary services, which we have seen a lot happening, where a company is, again, for example, doing blood test related diagnosis, but the data is being used for something completely different applications, obviously in the healthcare industry. But again, I think that goes back to commercialization of data and using that data to increase the value of the company.
Okay. And I think, Ramon, what's interesting is you mentioned earlier, you work for a company called Optimize AI, which helped exit. And I categorize that company more on the pharmaceutical analytics software category, which is not within this report. But one of the things that I've seen, and you've actually written about hyper-personalized medicine as well, and I feel like, especially for pharma products and therapy categories, I feel like there's a lot of companies that blend with the diagnosis category along with actually building pharmaceutical products as well. I mean, how do you look at the diagnosis category, and how does that blend with other things like genetics, we'll get into in a little bit, and as well as pharmaceutical products?
So that's a very good question, and it actually piggybacks what I just previous speaker was just saying, is that you have to, when looking at business category, you have to figure out how to monetize the data. So actually, Optimize AI was saying that there's these companies with these huge consumer or insurance space, and they have huge treasures of data. So how do we make that data actionable? From that data, can we convert that into insights for drug discovery? So that's kind of how we see the pictures. Like there's going to be a series of companies that will build upon the data that's out there and available, and that was what Optimize AI was trying to do. And then, of course, it was, like I said, there's now a contract research organization who is now using Optimize AI to do that on behalf of large biopharmaceuticals. So that's, again, how you get built into the value chain within the larger biopharmaceutical area. And so I think what we're going to talk about, there's so much overlap between the different categories. And so you have to figure out where you sit kind of within the Venn diagram.
Okay. Awesome. Chi, did you have anything else that you wanted to add before we move on?
No.
Okay. Awesome. I want to make sure that we get to the health management category at least before the time limit's up. The next category that I want to talk about has a lot of overlap with the diagnosis category. Again, the diagnosis category was really focused on startups whose core functionality was to provide a process, a service, hardware solution, et cetera, to just identify a specific disease someone might have. And then the features of that is building additional products on top of it. For the genetics category, these are companies that have a lot of overlap with diagnosis and equipment as well. It's really products that are truly just focusing on sequencing services and the ecosystem around that. All right, or any companies that are building up products that are related to just mapping out DNA. And so this category is interesting though, because based on the data that I have, it's actually one of the most highest and most valuable companies based on average funding in the US at least. It has the highest exit percentage. It has a lot of strategic investors involved as well. It's a little bit more expensive category. And so if you compare all the categories that we have today, this is the category seems like it's the most interesting amongst the venture funding. And I broke it into 3 parts here, but actually before I even talk about this, Raymond, you have a couple slides that I think paint a pretty good picture of the genetics category. And so let's do that first, and then we can talk a little bit more details about how this category breaks apart. Is that good with you, Raymond? And just tell me when you want me to flip slides.
Perfect. So actually, this is to give you some context. This is actually something we prepared for some potential LPs about we're talking about this space. So let's go ahead and go to the first. So, I think especially what Kyle's pointing out, there's so much stats and statistics about the space, but we didn't want to, if we focus on that with the LPs, their eyes were kind of going to blur over. So we wanted to build a kind of a narrative about the space. And although it's not perfect, we compared it to one large company that was in the space and why we think it's a hot topic to be in. So next slide. Once upon a time, there was a Stanford dropout who formed a company called Theranos. And she, frankly, had an amazing vision. I mean, I still encourage everyone to go watch her TED Talk about her company and her vision for the future, because, frankly, it's what we're seeing today. Next slide. And, at the height, Theranos had close to a valuation of $10 billion with, major heavy hitters in the space. Here we had Betsy DeVos, who's the current Secretary of Education, and Rupert Murdoch, the head of Fox News, and collectively they almost had just them had a $500 million into Theranos. And there was investors such as Larry Ellison of Oracle, and most of the top VCs and multiple top VCs, including Lightspeed Ventures, were in Theranos. So this was a huge, huge deal, and they were investing into the founders' vision of how do we take non-intrusive information, turn that into data, and from that data get actual insights for both patients and for the healthcare science. Next slide. But I'm sure everyone on this call is aware of, it fell apart. It was, probably one of the largest kind of, at least according to the SEC, Theranos was committing fraud. They were committing fraud both to the public by making claims that they couldn't support, and to their investors, the venture capitalists and large and wealthy individuals, who say that their diagnostic tools for actually analyzing the blood samples were not actually collecting the data appropriately. The science simply wasn't there. And secondarily, the software or the data analytics that they were developing to actually analyze the samples were not actually producing the results that were promised. So next slide. And this led to there was the dissolving of Theranos and major lawsuits as home exiting the federal courthouse in San Jose. Again, litigation is still pending. There are multiple, and where I would say that this case is far from being over. In fact, nice as Kyle just actually pointed out, this is one of the hottest areas they're investing into. And this is my thesis, and this is what we were telling our LPs. Next slide. That what Theranos may have been, again, the wrong messenger, but the message is absolutely correct. That this is the one that most interesting in hot spaces to be in, because you have to do multiple things in order to make this space happen. This promise is still there, and like I said, go back to that TED Talk by Elizabeth Holmes, and you'll see that she's really talking about the transformation in general of this industry. In general, though, we should not just put all our eggs in one basket. We as investors should be looking at taking a diverse approach and investing into probably individual parts. So, and those parts are and I'll be talking about in the next slide. Is that there is kind of 4 elements that drive this area. One, you actually have to have investment in actual device, diagnostic tools, and a way of actually processing samples. You have to have business model transformation. Again, Theranos was actually inside, and I kind of screamed over it, but it was actually inside of Walgreens. That's how they were actually working with drugstores to collect the samples. So there is a medical research in general has to advance. Theranos the science wasn't there yet. I mean, we're approaching there now, but 4 or 5 years ago, trying to make a diagnosis based upon a small non-intrusive sample, we're just catching up to that now, half a decade later. And fourth, data and data collection. All the companies that we've been talking about so far are, again, how do you manage all this data? How do you make that data interchangeable? How do you deal with data privacy? It's something that has to be almost invested into separately. And then last is something that something we haven't talked about is the cost to actually sequence the genome. So, and this is going to be, I think, actually relevant and touches all points of this, is that when back in 2001, it was millions of dollars to run to actually sequence one's genome. And that price has dropped dramatically. And as in this slide, you can actually see that it's well outpacing Moore's law on how much the cost of sequencing the genome. And right now, it's kind of hovering, the cost is somewhere between, at lowest, is $250 to sequence one's entire human genome. And then the reason why I am focusing on that price is that once that price really drops below, I call it $100, that's when I think everyone, and then also insurance, will just be paying systematically to have everyone's genome ran, and then trying to see if there's any insights, both for the individual patient and then collectively for drug discovery and therapeutics in the future. So next slide. And so going to a portfolio approach, I think this is where I think we should be looking at these, again, not just Theranos, invest into one giant unicorn to drive the market, but actually looking at a portfolio. So, kind of going clockwise, we had 23andMe CEO, Anne Wojcicki, who really, she has the most she has one of the largest treasure troves of genomic data in the U.S. And kind of interesting facts about 23andMe is that 80% of all consumer genomics, at-home genomics, is actually done in the U.S. That has to do both with the interest in, what drives that is kind of the interest in genealogy in general, but also is particularly that our regulatory system in the U.S. actually allows for the collection of data. But funnily enough, talking about a company I previously worked for, they have this data, but now they have to figure out how to monetize it. And how do you monetize that data once you collect them beyond just giving a report back to the consumer? Going down to number 9, Inovio, they are, again, it's an AI for drug discovery company, but what makes them incredibly interesting is the fact that they are really pushing the science here. In fact, they're one on the forefronts of companies that are trying to develop, really trying to push AI to help accelerate the finding for a vaccine for COVID-19. And then going to number 10, you act as the CEO of Color, Ottoman Laraki, and this is what I mean about trying to deal with regulatory areas. So, Color is, they're not actually doing anything that's actually particularly special beyond what any diagnostic service can do. However, they have FDA approval, and that with that FDA approval means that they can be covered by insurance, and because they can be covered by insurance, they are able to sell thousands and hundreds of thousands of the kit to actually test for biomarkers related to breast cancer. And then last, which I think was actually kind of what the kind of core of this area is, the diagnostic tools. And so number 11 is Francis D'Souza in front of his Illumina machines. And anyone who's interested in investing into the space, especially anything that has to do with genomics, really has to look at Illumina and some of their competitive companies. The next generation's sequencing machines they're the ones who are driving that price to do genomics down, and they're getting more and more efficient at it. And everyone is really, this is what will allow bringing down that cost. You can't think about it the same way like CPU cost is within the cloud world. Is as long as if we can keep driving down that cost and come up with more efficient means to actually run genomic sequencing, that will drive the rest of the industry. And so again, Theranos was the wrong company, was too big to fail, and it was kept being propped up. But when looking at the space, think about all the parts of Theranos that one should have been investing into, and looking and investing into those companies instead. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks, Raymond. And I included, he has a lot of references here too, as well. But I hope that gives a little bit more color on the genetics category. Now I'll quickly go through some of the three most popular segments of this, and then we'll jump into questions here. So the first part, and where majority of companies fall into, is the sequencing services, is how I put it. And this is the category that companies that are startups are trying to provide end-to-end sequencing services. This is everything from preparation, extraction, sequencing, analytics, quality control. And it's primarily, a lot of them are either focused on direct-to-consumer, and a handful are working directly with healthcare companies. The consumers typically receive an at-home kit. We've seen this before. And they're just usually, collect a sample, and that's typically saliva or any other type of sample. Health services can also mail in a wide range of samples. Most companies seem to either have their own lab or use third-party equipment for sequencing. A lot of startups that I've seen in the space specifically mention that they either use Illumina or BGI technology as their primary sequencing hardware and equipment. There's startups that do mention that they use unique methods of analyzing genetic material, and examples of some startups using CRISPR to find gene sequencing or utilizing unique immunofluorescent staining. But the highlight for especially a lot of companies here is their focus is on their ability to sequence the genome, provide a broad set of insights, and to identify specific biomarkers for things like cancer, pathogens, diseases. For mostly consumers, it's to help them understand their health risks. And we've seen that, the ancestry reports, the gut health reports, genes, something Raymond was mentioning, that report that everyone gets. On the equipment side, there's a handful of companies that provide various solutions that support the sequencing workflows. There are companies that provide sequencing instruments that include the consumables and reagents and analytics software. There's others that provide preparation instruments that typically combine multiple steps into one device. That's the preparation, enrichment, and cleaning. Startups in the instruments, startup instruments typically differentiate in a couple different ways. It's very specific. So you have to definitely dive into this category. Some use, like I actually talked about before, in the sequencing services, using CRISPR to analyze enzymes. This is a graph of a company called Quantapore that developed a single molecule sequencing technology that is capable of sequencing massive amounts of DNA. And to determine the sequence, they have fluorescent labeled DNA strands that are threaded through, and this is kind of image of what this actually looks like, it's threaded through an array of nanopores. And as they exit the array, they generate a signal that is read with their equipment. And so there's a lot of really unique instruments here. But there's also, there's already pretty big players like aluminum BGI technologies as well. But the highlights for the equipment category, it starts in this section, really are trying to provide flexibility by being able to target sequencing analysis or genome scale analysis. They also innovate by the scale of their operations and the amount of DNA that they can sequence in unison. On the software side, there's startups in this section that break apart into a couple different ways. Majority are focused on providing advanced analysis and visualization solutions, right? These tools typically analyze raw data, and you can kind of see a view or a visualization of this. They analyze raw genetic data, allow users to filter that data in a variety of different ways, identify specific variants, and then also try to provide infrastructure that can handle analyzing these mass data sets. And then there's a handful of startups, and it's hard to see in these pictures below, that are trying to provide workflows to help labs manage their sequencing workflows. A lot of what you're seeing in the software category, there's startups that are trying to build out their own genome databases and proprietary databases based on the data they're collecting to provide insights on the types of diseases or genes, variants, etc. But one of the things, and there's a couple other categories. There's companies that are doing prep and test kits, others that are doing synthesis or editing. But I'm curious from the panel, building off of Raymond's story, how do you guys approach a space like this? Are you going to be focusing? Do you like to focus on the tools, like the equipment, the assays, prep, the test kits, the actual physical hardware? Or do you like to focus a little bit more on the software, the analytics tools, the genome databases? I mean, what should investors be looking at in the different parts that Raymond was mentioning that's required for the space to really flourish?
From a DigiTx perspective, we would be more focused on the analytics and the software and the data sets and how will you be using and offering insights. Digital biomarkers, things like that would be of interest to us specifically. Not to say we would shy away from equipment-based startups. I think it's important to look at those too, but we tend to be more focused from a software perspective and analytics.
Okay.
Right. And we've actually looked at some of the IVD diagnostic spaces and realized, it's pretty capital-intensive spaces and with a pretty lot of competitors. And then we started moving away from, probably by Series A, seed plan Series A, you're still like rolling the dice pretty much. Mm-hmm. And then we when we look at software, and we're actually pretty interested in see how genetic will be integrated into existing clinical practices. People have been having come up with theses like a polygenetics were going to work well, but people also debate about about the data, about the diversification of ethnicity, where the data collected from. So cases like that, is what we've been looking into, and also of course in the genetic counseling, it's showing that can help people to answer some of the questions as well.
Yeah, and I think to add on to Chi's point, the genetic counseling space is also a good opportunity because there are few genetic counselors. If you're going to offer software-based, machine learning-based solutions, that might be an area to focus on. So applications that help couples determine what issues they could face, or something that's going to be scalable and based on, say, the way a genetic counselor works. So granting people more access to that technology or that ability to do screening without having to go into an office. It might be something that investors may want to focus on and think about in a near-term future.
Okay. Rob, Raymond, do you have any other points or thoughts to add there?
I think I agree with both of you. Rather than focusing on actual equipment, I think the focus is going to be, and I think we look at it as well, is going to be on the data and machine learning applications. Yes, I think if the equipment is needed, again, I like to think that without equipment there is no next step or collecting the data, but the value is going to be with the data and what are the different monetizing strategies for that data, just outside the primary one that these companies will be focusing on.
So, we are all professionals here, so I'll talk about a little inside baseball within space. So going back to data and how hard it is to actually work within the traditional framework. So again, companies that have collected large amounts of genomic data are trying to build up business, and they have hundreds of millions of dollars of investment inside of them. It's public knowledge that 23andMe has around layoffs. We kind of got buried under the news from about COVID-19 and right after JP Morgan Health Week. And who were those people? The teams that were actually laid off were all the people who were working in trying to make that data actionable, right? Trying to actually take that data and monetize it. So they had all this consumer data, and they had a lot of people. Again, the grand majority, I think 3 out of 4 people tend to opt in to be further contacted by 23andMe. And so they talked about, okay, we're going to use that patient data, their consumer data to both do future clinical research with the using AI modules and license that data to other companies. And secondarily, they were going to do clinical recruitment for drug trials. Now, those, I don't know, again, other news has consumed the day, but those teams have been laid off. Those teams are gone within 23andMe. So the question is, okay, we collect this data. We have to now figure out, there has to be companies out there who actually can make that data useful for actually, the benefit of society. And then, and by proxy, for actually having benefit of society, having a good exit.
I think that's a very good point, Ramon. I think, one of the things that we are looking at and thinking about is actually, once you have the data, as you said, there needs to be application, there needs to be people in the company that are able to create those secondary or tertiary business models. One of the little bit different business model that we are seeing, and we are working with a company right now to validate it, is actually not worrying about how the company would use the data, but rather making that data available to anyone and everyone who is interested in it. And that can be, the third parties can be either using it directly or combining with something else. And this is, I think, when probably we started, this is where the cybersecurity and healthcare is meeting. So I'll give you our own personal example. We are looking at and working with a company, hopefully the research will be published pretty soon, where we are trying to see if we can, encrypt the data in a way that is never revealing to the third party, but they are still, able to use that data. And again, I'm not smart enough to talk about those cryptographic methods, but the company that we are working with uses homomorphic encryption to do those type of arrangements. But again, the idea is, yes, you have the data now. Does this have to be the same company that commercializes it, or can you actually operate a model where your data becomes part of your platform and you're not worrying about how exactly it's being used, as long as there is a monetization strategy for that data.
Right. And another thing about like a data in genetic space, and because a lot of time there's people are pretty skeptical in terms of talking about like genetic data, and the top one question will be like, are you selling my data? And I think when startup doing that, like trying to monetize the data, they also have to be careful the intent use of the data of the other party at the same time, well, that will be, benefiting, patient, and also how really, like, let's say sell, right? Or share, or in some sort of ways through some sort of partnerships. To a certain degree of protection is also limited the leverage on the table, like, working with the partners, like how much money the data actually worth for. I think those are all, I'm definitely not field expert, but those are some, the point, like some of the challenges when I see, genetic companies and the partnerships, like some of the challenges, like, during the monetization process.
And from a clinical perspective too, as well as this, with a plethora of genetic companies popping up, offering lots of information to people, it's how do you integrate all this information in the clinical workflow, and how do you make it actionable? Currently, physicians are quite overwhelmed with a lot of information. There are lots of issues going on. How do you fit this into the day, and what are you going to do with this? There's got to be some way of actually making this digestible for both patient and physician or healthcare provider, so that all this data that we're generating is not going to go to waste, and it's actually going to be able to be used efficaciously. So I think genetic companies need to also factor that in, that who are you going to, the patient is not the only customer here. The people working with the data would be genetic counselors, hospital systems maybe. So it's gotta appeal to everybody, so that it's of utility versus just a nice to have.
And thinking about it from like almost an enterprise perspective about going to data. So a data play, especially thinking about genomic data, is that so companies like In Vitro, which is actually based in South San Francisco, and this is something again where VCs, Silicon Valley traditional VCs, are actually might be really smart at, is the fact that, and a good place to invest is that data science, right? Is actually, how do you, I just previously mentioned, like how do you take all this data and make it actionable? Well, that's a data science question, because for a lot of data science is just cleaning the data. A lot of it is just actually putting it together in such a way that it could be usable. And so In Vitro, they're not reinventing the wheel. They don't have any magic AI modules, but are taking tools that are off the shelf right now and applying them in a smart way to get the data, and so it's actionable for biotech and biopharma.
Awesome. Great. Well, I think I'll move on quickly here before you guys jump in. We only got about 20 minutes left, so this is probably going to be the last category that we're going to cover. I'm actually really interested in hearing all you guys' insights on this category as well. So this is the health management category. Generally, what is a health management company that I placed here? It's any startup that its main function is to build a web or mobile application that helps a user manage their health, whether it's general, proactive, it could be, chronic condition, etc. It first starts with tools that are given directly to a user to manage their health, and that can expand into a lot of other categories like telemedicine, devices, etc. But that's what is defined here. Now, there's a lot of startups in this space, and it doesn't actually receive as much funding as you saw with the device and diagnosis category. But I think it's the most interesting, because you're seeing, and from my perspective, almost many of the other categories that we talked today are kind of converging in on the health management category. It's important that we talked about even earlier, for devices, genetics, diagnosis, building out workflows that can take actionable results. And a lot of these health management companies are building those dashboards to take actionable steps. Now, the health management category, I broke it into 16 subsections here. The most popular is general health, chronic care management, and then mental health. These also overlap with many of the other ones, categories that are listed here. But I'll quickly try to run through some of the most important things. It's pretty straightforward for the health management category, and then I'll jump into questions, and then we'll kind of close out the rest of the presentation. But for the most part, the best way to look at the health management category is looking at how startups collect data, the actions they take based on the data that they collected, and then how they help individuals manage their health, right? For the general health category, they're pretty innovative in the methods that they're using to collect a variety of different data. This can be from wearables, providers, insurance, assessments, surveys. Some even schedule tests for users to do MRIs or lab tests and to bring in some of that information. Some use employer data or provider data and population health data to kind of identify patients that are in need of support and need to take an initiative. Now, a lot of these startups, for every segment here, how they take action is most of them, and this is the overall trend in the differentiator, is being able to provide a personalized program that users can take to manage their health, regardless of what it is, right? And to manage that, they're providing, especially in the general health category, they provide coaching. There's a lot of content that guides users. There's daily checklists. There's a lot of most of these applications become very gamified in the ways in which they're trying to reward users and help them understand their overall health, right? The chronic care and mental health is slightly a little bit different. A lot of these startups collect data that's self-reported or from smart devices. A lot of times they work with providers as well and take health records. A lot of the same things. They're providing educational content, advice. It starts to especially get into telemedicine services and therapy lessons, how chronic care boosts engagement. They're using gamified methods, reminders for medication, coaching, chatbot assistance, group interventions. The chronic care is quite interesting because a lot of these companies, specifically in this category, which is dealing with things like diabetes, but more than one type of chronic condition, a lot of them are providing their own social network. They have a lot of peers being able to talk to one another to making sure that they can get and overcome some of the issues or work through the issues that they have. And some very unique startups in this space are actually working directly with payers and providers to identify patients in need, help automatically enroll and manage the patient and what would be the best treatment and personalized program for them, track their progress, make sure they complete it, and only then if they complete it, they're paid by the provider or the payer to complete the program. And mental health is somewhat similar to many of the other categories. They have, their main differentiator is the program that they have to help users manage their health. A lot of times there's video therapy sessions, especially for mental health. It overlaps a lot with telemedicine. They provide exercise programs. They provide in-person therapy. There's online coaching, and so on. Now, it's more prevalent in telemedicine than health management, but there's actually some telemedicine startups, we're not going to be able to get into it, but I'm going to talk about it, is they're even offering their own supplements and medication and their own brands of products that they're issuing to their users, and you're seeing that more in mental health as well. But for the most part, it is this combination for how startups, all of them differentiate, is the personalized programs that they can create, how they can continue to drive engagement. There's unique ways in which these companies are getting and creating a business model for that as well. And I kind of want to turn it to the panel. And I have two big questions for you guys. One is, how do you think about winning startups within health management? Are you looking at specific startups that are catered towards a specific condition? I know, Chi, you made an investment in Mugali, which is seems like more specific on chronic care. Or do you think that there's an opportunity to win with applications that offer 50 plus different care programs? And then my second question, and I'm giving this to you guys now because we're going to get close to the end and have to finish up here quickly. But there seems to be a lot of health categories converging on health management, right? This is devices, this is telemedicine, this is even provider products like management category, analytics, even the CRM categories are trying to identify patients and make sure that they're enrolling in programs. Where do you think the top health management companies are going to emerge from? And is this going to be in this category, or are we going to see it kind of be a blend of other categories? So those are the two questions. Would love if you guys can give some light on either one of those.
Yeah, I can try to address the first one. So in terms of being disease specific versus broad coverage, it's pretty interesting because we mentioned about before about the data. I think in the mid layer, analytic companies always to collect more disease-related data, regardless in what categories. But in patient-facing application, we've seen before, some of the success, some of the companies like Patient Likes Meat and my health team, those are more of like, community-based and peer support when it was a big thing. And then comes question about, unit economy and who's going to pay for it and how much they're going to pay for it. And then now we're at another stage where, people start to focus more on specific diseases, as you mentioned, Gali, they focus on the IBD space, and there are other focus on cancer, mental health, hypertension plus diabetes. And I think being disease focused, you can start looping in more high quality channel partners and maybe partnership with the drug developers and the private insurance, the self-insurance, those parties to work with you. And you don't have to, think about the broader space, how we're going to do this, with different type of categories. And at the same time, you can add more, value added services that people are willing to pay, higher prices. And also referring to another point I mentioned, a lot of those chronic diseases are high touch. Having just, an app which covers 50 different types of diseases may not be sufficient enough, especially nowadays. A lot of patients are flooded with, probably 20 apps on their smartphones. And also from a defensibility perspective, that probably going to give you more edge, not only by how many patients you have on the platform, but also, how deeply you're integrated into the system. And definitely, the more value you add, the more integrated you are, then the stickier the products, going to become. So that's just my 2 cents, based on focus on the broader space versus diseases.
I would echo Chi's point in terms of like, you don't want to get into a situation where you're offering a ton of things. It may come down to the point where how good is the solution? You've got 50 plus care programs. What's the best? People are going to be kind of lost in choice. I'm not saying that people shouldn't be given the choice, but you should be able to curate, a large number of things down to what is best practices versus just simply offering a plethora of solutions. I'll cite WellDoc. WellDoc's a great example of the diabetes management tool. They're doing very well. And if you think about it, if you're kind of hyper focused on diabetes, you're going to find channel partners a lot more easily. And then once you do that, you can kind of expand to other chronic diseases bit by bit. It's kind of like, I won't say it's a land grab. I'd say it's like, it's a marathon. So you got to find your niche and then expand to see where there are intersections in a Venn diagram versus just simply putting out a whole ton of solutions, which actually result in nothing but a turnoff from a patient perspective, a physician, healthcare provider perspective, and as such, you lose your customer base. So that's kind of how I would look at it.
Raymond, Gaurav, any thoughts?
So we've looked at companies in the space, and the biggest hurdle for why we haven't invested in the space yet is that, again, I think I was mentioned earlier about defensibility. And so, is your app or whatever you're developing, going to be outperform Apple Health? Or Google, the tool that Google is going to develop for actually aggregating patient data with their and also Project Baseline. So it's a space that is, I think, again, it's a good space to be in, and it's constantly looking at these companies within it. But there's a lot of questions around the business model to make them work, in the space, consumer facing space.
So I think my point of view, I agree with, I think, first couple of gentlemen. I think there are 2 distinct ways to look at it, right? One is if you have an app for a single disease, then it needs to be deep enough that you're covering the entire spectrum for that disease for it to be valuable. What we have seen is there are quite a few apps that either do partial or just at the beginning or the end. I think what we have seen in the past or now is having that complete spectrum compatible with providers. is something that works when you are focusing on a single disease. And if not, then I think, you are again going back to the category of, are you monitoring or are you diagnosing? And if that's the value proposition, then you probably want to have a broader categories of diseases or conditions. But those are, sort of ways that I look at things and my 2 cents on it.
Awesome. And, I know we're at the last 5 minutes here, so we're not going to be able to go through the rest of the presentation. There's a lot of other categories, but you guys all have the resources for both the Excel spreadsheet with the list of startups, the documents. So I think that's everything we need. And at the very end of this presentation, there's a list of about 30 companies that are currently fundraising or looking to fundraise in the future and are interested in, happy to chat with other investors. And so you guys all have a list of the companies that are currently fundraising. I guess to kind of conclude everything, I wanted to ask, I don't know if any of the panelists want to, I think there's one question from the Q&A, if any of those panelists want to jump on that question. But the final question that I wanted to ask the panelists is, do you have any advice for new healthcare investors? And is there any categories in healthcare that you're currently excited about looking to make investments in?
I can kind of give you a short answer to that question, I think. Make sure the people you're investing in, the companies you're investing in, have a go-to-market strategy. Make sure that they take the time to invest, and money to invest in market research, talking to a marketing consultant. There are lots of fantastic, independent marketers out there, and they got to have a plan, because you can build the best device, best software app, but if you don't have a plan as to how to sell it, you're not going to get any traction that you want. So I think one of the investment criteria is that when an investor, at least from my perspective, this is something that I've seen, is ask the team, do you have a go-to-market strategy? Have you spoke to a marketing consultant? Some people may have a good plan. It may not work, but it doesn't hurt to rubber stamp that with somebody who actually has experience in the space. So at least that's kind of my perspective. And I've seen startups unfortunately fail because they have a great product, but they don't have a marketing strategy. So.
Yeah, and I want to add a couple points on top of that. And I think Arnold mentioned it greatly about go-to-market strategy, because if we look at the past, 5 years, it's very common for digital health company to raise, 3, trenches with seed round before, raising the inflection point of a Series A, or sometimes they are not even being able to make it. I think a lot of times because digital health is healthcare, software, it sort of falls in between B2B and healthcare and sometimes consumer and healthcare. It's a very low barrier to entry, but at the same time, it's healthcare is a very incentive driven system where, when people come into the space, they recognize the unmet need, clinical unmet need, they recognize, the solution, but it's really hard to get, the people who pay to engage. And it also has to do with, patient expectation. For example, we see a lot of, medication management companies and or care management company in the space of out-of-pocket, mostly out-of-pocket like mental health, and people are more willing to pay. And then the monetization strategy is very straightforward, right? Like you just have a provider and you have a patient, you have users. But a lot of times it also, when patients do expect a reimbursement company to pay for the service and the product and solutions, and that's where you have to also think about the utility, as those gentlemen mentioned, like why would payers to cover this, and what provider actually looking into, and the payers looking into in terms of like outcome to enough to incentivize them to do it. And I think those are the things that knowing different stakeholders in the system, that to make critical decision to how to approach the market, it's very, very critical, very important.
Thanks, Chief. Gaurav, Raymond, any other final thoughts on advice or categories you're excited about?
So, I would say that we're still looking at anything to do with, again, I think so as most people in that panel, we're looking at anything to do with actionable data. So how do you take data and how do you, do something with it? But that is to advice for first-time investors who are looking at this space is that there is a learning curve because we're dealing with different players. And again, it's not too different from any enterprise play. However, the cycle and the players, again, whether or not you're working with large clinical groups or you're working with pharma or you're working with contract research organizations, how they operate and how they do deals are completely, are unique to that industry. And and you can think about it as an industry, and so you have to have some concept of how the industry functions. But everyone here on this panel and everyone in the audience are incredibly smart people, so it's not magic. It can be learned. Just take the time to actually think that through first.
Thanks, Ramon. Gaurav, any advice?
No, I think I agree with everything that other panelists have to say. I think for me, or one advice purely from where I sit and how we see things, being an early stage investor and partner with a lot of these companies. One thing that keeps coming out that it's a marathon, right? I mean, you're in healthcare, you're not in software, or you're not in any other industry. So long-term vision and view is the most important thing I can stress on.
Awesome. Well, thanks, guys. I really appreciate you. You hung around for the full 2 hours. I know it's a lot, but I really appreciate it. Thanks for giving some color and insight. And thanks everyone for attending and joining all the content. I reshared the content again, and I'll send up a follow-up email to everyone as well. But thanks for attending, and feel free to reach out directly to any of the panelists. These are great resources to use, especially if you're interested in healthcare and for deal flow as well. So thank you all for attending. Really appreciate it. Stay safe. And we'll see you at the next event. The next event will be it'll probably be infrastructure. So I'll stay tuned. You'll receive an email about that shortly when that event will be. But thanks, guys. Thanks for attending.
All right.
Thank
Thanks,
you very
Kyle.
much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Kyle. Take care, everybody.